There are secrets that governments keep. There are secrets that corporations keep. And then there are secrets so enormous, so terrifying, so fundamentally incompatible with everything humanity believes about its place in the universe, that the men who carry them cannot speak them aloud for decades. Not because they lack courage, but because they understand that the world is not ready, that the institutions built to protect humanity are the same institutions that would destroy anyone who threatened the carefully constructed reality those institutions depend upon. This is the story of one such man, a man who went to the moon, a man who saw something there that no human being was supposed to see, a man who spent 50 years carrying that knowledge in silence, and a man who in the final days of his life made a decision that changed everything. He decided to tell the truth. The year was 1969. America was locked in the most consequential competition in human history. The space race was not simply a scientific endeavor. It was an ideological war fought in the blackness of space with rockets and courage and the lives of extraordinary men as weapons. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik in 1957. They had put the first human in space in 1961, and America had responded with the full force of its industrial and scientific and financial power with a single audacious promise. Before the decade was out, an American would walk on the moon. The men who were chosen to fulfill that promise were not ordinary men. They were test pilots and engineers and scientists who had been selected from thousands of candidates for their physical perfection, their psychological stability, their capacity to perform at the absolute limits of human capability under conditions that would break lesser men. They were trained for years. They were prepared for every contingency that the best minds at NASA could imagine. They were ready for the unexpected. What they were not prepared for was the truly impossible. The astronaut at the center of this story trained for 3 years before his mission. He ran simulations thousands of times. He studied lunar geology and navigation and survival protocols until the information was encoded not just in his memory but in his body, in his hands, in his reflexes. He was as prepared as any human being had ever been for anything. And none of it prepared him for what he found. The launch was flawless. The Saturn V rocket performed exactly as designed, generating more thrust than any machine humanity had ever built, lifting its 3 passengers out of the gravitational embrace of Earth and sending them on a trajectory toward another world. From inside the capsule, the astronaut watched Earth shrink behind him. He had seen photographs of Earth from space. He thought he knew what it would look like. He did not know. Nothing prepared him for the reality of seeing his entire world, his entire civilization, every human being he had ever known or loved, reduced to a small blue sphere hanging in an infinite black void. It was the most profound moment of his life. He did not yet know that a more profound moment was coming. The journey to the moon took 3 days. 3 days of floating in a metal capsule smaller than a family car surrounded by the most hostile environment in existence. 3 days of checklists and mission protocols and communication with Houston and the careful management of systems that stood between 3 human beings and instant death. 3 days of looking out a small porthole at a universe that had never seemed so vast or so indifferent. And then the moon appeared. Not as a distant light as they had known it from Earth, but as a world. A real place with craters and mountains and valleys, at a surface that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Grey and ancient and silent, waiting. The lunar orbit insertion burn worked perfectly. They circled the moon at an altitude of 60 miles, watching the surface scroll beneath them, identifying landmarks matching what they saw to the maps they had memorized. The landing site was in the Sea of Tranquility, a wide flat plain that looked from orbit like the safest possible place to set down a spacecraft. It looked smooth. It looked empty. It was neither. The lunar module separated from the command module and began its descent. The astronaut was focused completely on his instruments, on his checklist, on the thousands of variables that had to be managed simultaneously to bring the spacecraft safely to the surface. The altitude was decreasing. The computer was calculating. The communications with Houston were constant and clear. And then at an altitude of approximately 3,000 feet, Something appeared on the surface below them that was not on any map. That was not in any briefing. That was not in any simulation. That was not supposed to exist. The astronaut saw it first. His training kicked in immediately. He reported what he was seeing to Houston in the calm, measured tones that NASA required of its people under all circumstances. Houston acknowledged the transmission. There was a pause, and then Houston told him to continue the descent, to proceed with the landing, to follow the mission plan. The tone in the communicator's voice was different. Something had changed. Something in Houston had shifted in that moment, in a way that the astronaut felt rather than heard. But he continued. He was a professional. He followed orders. He landed. What he had seen from altitude looked different from the surface. It looked larger. It looked more structured. It looked less like a natural geological formation and more like something that had been made, not by human hands. Human hands had never touched the moon before that moment. But something had been there before. Something had left a mark on the lunar surface that was too regular, too precise, too geometrically deliberate to be the result of meteorite impacts or volcanic activity, or any natural process that the astronaut's considerable scientific training could account for. He did not approach it immediately. Mission protocols were clear. The immediate priority after landing was assistance check, followed by preparation for the extravehicular activity. He and his colleague went through the checklist. They suited up. They prepared. And through the entire process, the structure was visible through the porthole of the lunar module, just sitting there, approximately 400 meters from their landing site, partially buried in lunar regolith, as if it had been there for a very long time, long enough for the dust of centuries of micrometeorite bombardment to accumulate around its base. But the parts that were exposed above the surface were smooth, reflective, not corroded, not degraded, as if whatever material they were made of was immune to the processes that weathered everything else on the lunar surface. When the astronaut finally stepped onto the moon and felt the grey dust compress under his boots and looked up at the black sky and the distant blue earth, he had about 30 seconds to experience the transcendence of that moment before his professional focus reasserted itself and he began moving toward what he had seen. Houston was quiet, unusually quiet. They were tracking his position. They knew where he was going. They did not tell him to stop. They did not tell him to proceed. They said nothing. The structure was larger up close than it had appeared from the lunar module. The sections visible above the regolith surface formed geometric shapes that the astronaut recognized immediately. Not because he had seen anything like them before, but because the shapes were so fundamentally mathematical, so clearly the part of the deliberate design that recognition was instantaneous and instinctive. Triangles, rectangles, angles that were not random, surfaces that were not rough, an architecture that was not natural. He reached out and touched it. Through his pressurized glove he could feel nothing of the surface texture, but the visual information was extraordinary. Up close the material had a quality unlike anything in his experience. It did not look like metal exactly. It did not look like stone exactly. It looked like something between those categories, something that had properties of both and the limitations of neither. He photographed it from multiple angles. He collected samples of the regolith immediately surrounding it. He measured what he could measure with the tools he had available. And then Houston spoke. The voice was different. Not his usual capsule communicator. Someone else. Someone senior. The message was brief and absolutely clear. He was to return to the lunar module immediately. He was to document nothing further. He was to speak of what he had seen to no one. The mission would continue on a modified plan. The extravehicular activity time would be shortened. The public record would reflect a nominal mission. And when he returned to Earth, he would be debriefed. He would understand at that debrief why these instructions were being given. He was asked to trust the process. He was asked to trust his country. He was an American. He was a military officer. He followed orders. The debrief took place over 3 days in a secure facility that the astronaut had never been to before and never visited again. The people in the room with him were not the familiar faces of the NASA hierarchy he had worked with for years. They were from agencies whose names he recognized but whose personnel he had never met. They were calm, they were professional, they were absolutely serious. And they told him things that explained what he had found on the moon in ways that were more disturbing than any explanation he had imagined on the long journey home. They told him that he was not the first person to have seen what he had seen, that evidence of structures on the lunar surface had been detected in orbital photographs going back to the earliest unmanned missions, that the decision had been made at the highest levels of government that this information could not be released to the public. Not because the public could not handle the philosophical implications of the discovery, but because the strategic implications were so severe, so potentially destabilizing to the entire geopolitical order that any disclosure was assessed as an existential risk. The world in 1969 was balanced on a nuclear knife edge. Two superpowers, each capable of ending human civilization, pointed their weapons at each other across an ideological divide. Into that environment, the revelation that humanity was not alone in the universe, that another intelligence had visited the moon before us, was not something that could be safely introduced. The astronaut understood the logic. He did not agree with it, but he understood it, and he signed the document that was placed in front of him, not because he was threatened, although the implications of the meeting were clear enough, but because he was a patriot, because he believed in the institutions of his country even when those institutions were doing things he found wrong, and because he had two children at home who needed their father to come back from this briefing and from every briefing that followed. He kept the secret for 50 years, that is the span of a human life, long enough for the word that existed when he found the structure to be replaced by a different word entirely, long enough for the men who had sworn him to secrecy to die. Long enough for the strategic logic of 1969 to become something that needed to be re-examined in the light of everything humanity had learned since. Long enough for him to become old enough to know that he was running out of time, old enough to understand that if he did not speak, the knowledge would die with him and the world would never know. He began preparing his confession several years before he made it. He wrote in a private journal recording details that he had kept only in memory for decades. Measurements, coordinates, visual descriptions so precise and so specific that no one who read them could dismiss them as the confused memories of an elderly man. He was not confused. His mind remained sharp even as his body failed. And his memory of what he seen on the moon was clearer than his memory of anything else in his long life. Some experiences mark themselves so deeply in a person that time cannot touch them. What he had found on the lunar surface was such an experience. He gave his testimony to a journalist in a recorded session that lasted 4 hours. He described everything: the appearance of the structure from altitude, the approach on foot across the lunar regolith, the texture and geometry of the exposed sections, the material quality unlike anything in human manufacture or natural formation, the silence from Houston during his approach, the voice that interrupted his mission and told him to return immediately, the debrief, the document he signed, the names of the men in the room which he provided with clarity and specificity. He asked the journalist to wait until after his death to publish, not because he feared consequences for himself. He was beyond consequences, but because he wanted to be sure his family was protected, that his children, now in their 50s, with their own children and grandchildren, would not bear the weight of what was coming. He died 11 days after the recording session. His family found the private journal hidden in a false panel in his study bookshelf, exactly where he had told the journalist it would be. The journal matched the recording in every detail, every measurement, every observation, every name. The consistency was not the consistency of a prepared lie. It was the consistency of a lived truth recorded in two different ways at two different times by a man who had been carrying it for half a century. The scientific community responded to the disclosure in predictable ways. Official denials, demands for physical evidence that by definition could not be produced because the samples taken near the structure had been confiscated in a debrief and had never entered the public record. Accusations of memory distortion in elderly subjects. Alternative explanations involving natural geological processes that the people proposing them knew were inadequate to explain what had been described. The machinery of institutional denial is powerful and well practiced. It has been used many times before. It does not require conscious deception by every participant. It requires only that the people inside institutions do what institutions always do, which is protect the institution first and pursue the truth second. But the scientific community did not respond in only predictable ways. There were also the responses that could not be dismissed. The researchers who found in the astronaut's public testimony and the privately released journal details that correlated with anomalies in official NASA lunar photography that had been documented for years. Features in specific orbital photographs that had been noted as unexplained in internal NASA communications released under Freedom of Information requests decades after the missions. Coordinates that matched what the astronaut had described. Shadows that fell in directions inconsistent with natural formations. Geometric regularities that had been marked as anomalous in the raw data and then omitted from the published scientific record. The official NASA photograph archive is one of the largest collections of imaging data in human history. Hundreds of thousands of photographs taken from lunar orbit and from the surface during the Apollo missions. Most of them have never been examined in detail by independent researchers. The processing power required to analyze them systematically did not exist in the decades immediately following the missions. It exists now, and the people who have begun applying that processing power to the archive are finding things that correlate, things that accumulate, things that individually might be dismissed and collectively cannot be. The astronaut knew this would happen. It was part of why he chose to speak when he did. Not simply to relieve himself of a burden that had grown heavier with every passing year, but because he understood that the technological moment had arrived when independent verification would become possible, when his account could be tested against data that he had not provided, when the truth he had carried alone could find corroboration in sources that no one could accuse of coordination with a dying old man. He wanted the record to be complete. He wanted the generation that came after him to have what he had never been given, not the managed partial truth of official channels, not the carefully worded non-answers of government spokespeople. The actual record, the actual coordinates, the actual description of what he had seen with his own eyes on the surface of the moon on a day in 1969 when he was the most alone any human being had ever been and the most connected to something, it texted.